Hey everybody, welcome to Parker Hill Church Online. I'm so glad that you've taken the time to join us for these few minutes as we reconnect with the heart of God and recalibrate our minds with His truth. And my hope and my prayer is that God will meet you wherever you are right now and speak to you in a very personal and very powerful way. Hey, if you're watching this service by yourself, let me encourage you to invite a few other people to join you next time and create what we call a watch party. A watch party is where you watch the service together with a group of people, then talk about it, maybe even enjoy a meal together. We have a page on our website that explains how to host your own watch party, so check that out, find your people, and be the church wherever you are. Well, this weekend, we as a nation are celebrating Independence Day, which is really the birthday of our nation. It was on July 4th, 1776, that the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and voted to approve a Declaration of Independence from England, which gave birth to a new nation called the United States of America. And then in the very early days of this nation, our founders also adopted a national motto. It's the phrase, E pluribus unum. And that phrase was included on the seal of the United States in 1782. You can still see it on the back of every dollar bill and on the back of every dime, E pluribus unum. It's a Latin phrase that means out of many, one. And that phrase represents the dream that the founders of this nation had, that we would be a nation of people from many different backgrounds who would be bound together by one purpose, one vision, one set of ideals. And that even though we are many, we would be one. And throughout our history as a nation, as you know, there have been many times when we have struggled to live up to that motto. And right now, we as a nation find ourselves again in a moment like that. I don't know about you, but it feels like right now, we are not the United States of America. We're the divided states of America. I mean, it just feels like we are divided right now by so many things. We're divided by race, by class, by financial status, by demographics. But of all the things that divide us, I think we are most deeply divided right now by politics. I mean, think about it. We have even found a way to politicize a virus. Like right now, we even see the coronavirus through red lenses or blue lenses. I mean, that's how deeply divided we are as a nation on this 244th birthday of these United States of America. So I thought it would be good for us to take a break from our teaching series in the book of James and just spend a few minutes today talking about this political divide. And here's why I want to talk about this. Because in these next 4 months, between now and November 3rd, that sense of division is only going to become deeper and more bitter. It really is. And the question we need to ask ourselves as Christians on this 4th of July weekend is this question: how should we live in a culture that is so politically divided? How should we as Christians respond to this cultural moment, this spirit of division that we find ourselves in? Well, here's my answer to that question. We need to figure out how to disagree politically and yet love unconditionally. We've got to live in this tension of disagreeing politically, because we always will, and yet loving and modeling for other people what it means to love unconditionally. The best birthday gift we can give this nation of ours right now is to show the world what it looks like to love others unconditionally, even though we may not always agree with them or even with each other politically. And listen, we as Christians of all people should be able to do this. Even though E pluribus unum is the motto of our nation, I think it is also a phrase that describes God's heart for the church. I mean, that phrase should describe us, out of many, one. The Christian church is intended to be a place where people from all backgrounds are bound together by something greater than our differences, where we are bound together by our common experience of being sinners who've been given God's grace. I mean, we of all people should be able to disagree politically and yet love unconditionally. But let me warn you about something. Here's what that will require of us. Between now and November 3rd, here's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to make sure that we put our faith ahead of our politics, that we put our faith lens out in front of our political lens. And now here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you don't have an opinion. You should have an opinion. I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't talk about politics or run for office. I think we all should lean into what's happening in our nation and be thinking people. And for those of you who feel called to enter the fray, you should step right in. But listen, we have to make sure that we don't allow the divisiveness of our culture to infect our hearts or to corrupt our message or to distract us from our mission. We got to figure out how to disagree politically with each other and people outside the church, and yet love unconditionally. So today, for a few minutes, I want to look at the words of Jesus. These are some of the last words that he spoke just hours before he went to the cross. I want to draw your attention to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 13. Now, before I start reading the passage, let me just kind of set the scene for you. At this point, Jesus was about to be betrayed and arrested, and his time on earth was limited. So he gathers his closest followers in a private room where they would share one last meal together. It was the Jewish Passover meal. And when they gathered in that room, Jesus did something profound. He washed the feet of his disciples. Here's what happens. Verse 4, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Now, let me explain what this is all about. In that day, there was no such thing as concrete or asphalt, so the roads were basically dirt trails. And when it rained, the roads were mud trails. And the livestock in that day used the same roads that people did, which added another very unpleasant element to the whole travel situation. And when you were traveling from place to place within a city like Jerusalem, you would travel there by foot. And the footwear of that day was an open sandal. So you can imagine what your feet looked like and what they smelled like by the time you arrived at your destination. And that's why foot washing was a very important custom in that culture. Now, foot washing was especially important when you were getting together for a meal. In those days, they didn't sit in chairs like we have today. The tables were low, maybe a foot or 18 inches off the floor, and everybody would recline at the table, okay, with their legs stretched out behind them or next to them, which meant that your feet might be in close proximity to the food and to the noses of other people. And so foot washing was very important. And that's why in every Jewish home, there would be a pitcher of water and a basin that would be kept right by the door just for that purpose. Now, typically, this responsibility was given to the youngest child or the lowest ranking servant in the home because it was a very humble task. But there was no child or servant there in that room to wash feet. And so Jesus did what nobody else apparently was willing to do. He took a basin of water and he took a towel and he went to each one of his disciples and he washed their feet. It was a profound act of servanthood and a powerful example of what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. We are called to serve, not just be served. And then after that, they go on to share the Passover meal together. And then after that meal, Judas leaves the upper room and begins to make his way to the religious leaders where he will betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And after Judas leaves, Jesus kind of opens up his heart now to the 11 remaining disciples, and he gives them some final words of instruction and encouragement. I want to pick up reading here in verse 33. As I read these words, remember, this was a man who was only hours away from death on a cross. These were his final words. They carried a lot of weight. Here's what he said. He said, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me. And just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come." In other words, Jesus says, I'm about to leave you guys in this world. And I'm trusting you to carry on the work, to spread the message, to continue the revolution. And then he says this, he says, "A new command I give you. Love one another." He didn't say, this is a suggestion. He didn't say, a new option I give you. He didn't say, this is a good idea. Jesus said, this is a command I'm giving you. What we're talking about today is not something nice if you happen to have the time. This is not like extra credit work that you can do to improve your grade with God, This is not like the salad bar at Ruby Tuesdays. I'll have some prayer and I'll have some worship and I'll take a little bit of Bible study, but I think I'll pass on loving others. No. When we talk about loving the people around us, even people that we don't like or people we don't disagree with, we're talking about something that is at the very core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And then he goes on to describe what he means when he gives this command to love one another. He says, "A new command I give you, love one another like this. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." He just washed their feet. He was about to go to a cross. He says, here's the standard. Here's what it means to love, as I've loved you. You know, when my daughters were young, I had this little thing that I would say to them sometimes. I would say, I don't love you this much, honey. I don't love you this much or even this much. I love you this much. And she would say, oh, Daddy, I love you that much too. And, you know, after this final conversation with his disciples, do you know what Jesus did? He went to a cross. He stretched out his arms. They were nailed there. And he said, I love you this much. And listen, to every person who claims to be his follower, he says this, let this be the pattern for how you love the people in your life. Jesus says, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Think of it another way. Think of it as regifting. We all know what regifting is, don't we? According to a survey I saw recently, 40% of Americans say they have regifted something at least once. In fact, there's a website called regiftable.com. It has all kinds of information about the practice of regifting and some helpful tips. In fact, let me share a few of them with you. No extra charge for this. I'm throwing this in for free. So if you're a regifter, number one, don't give items that you have owned for a long time. A general rule of thumb, if you have to dust it off, it is not regiftable. Number two, this is very important, never give partially used gift cards. Here's another one. If you're going to regift, be sure you know who gave you the item so that you don't return something to the original giver. Only regift items to people who are not likely to see the original giver. It's a little bit complicated, but good advice, because we all do a lot of regifting. And you know, that's what Jesus was calling us to do. We just take the love that's been poured out to us and we regift that. We pass it on to other people. Even people that we don't really want to love very much. Jesus said, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. And then he goes on to say why this is so important. Verse 35, key verse. He says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples. By this, not by your cheesy Christian t-shirt, not by your cross tattoo, not by your fish symbol on the back of your car. I've seen some of the way that some of you drive. You probably should take the fish symbol off the back of your car. But Jesus says, no, by this will all men know that you are my disciples if you love one another. In other words, when the world sees a community of people where there is authentic love, a love that crosses boundaries of race and income and age and preference and opinions, when they see that, they will know that they have found something supernatural. The most compelling argument for the gospel will be the love of those who say they believe it. And I've seen this. People can have seemingly airtight arguments against God and against Christianity, but then their life begins to fall apart and they have a problem in their family or a serious illness or the loss of a job. And maybe at that moment, in the midst of all that, a Jesus follower comes alongside them and demonstrates authentic love. And do you know, it's amazing how all the intellectual arguments begin to fall away at that moment. The most compelling argument for the truth of the gospel will be the love of those who claim to believe it. But can I tell you, the opposite is also true? When the world sees a church full of people who are petty and critical and constantly bickering, they reject the message. So Jesus says, a new command I give you. Love one another, and here's how, as I have loved you. And let me tell you, this was no easy task for the men who were gathered in that upper room that night. I mean, there were some serious differences between these first followers of Jesus, even, believe it or not, political differences. Let me just read through a list of names. These were the 12 apostles, the closest followers of Jesus. Matthew 10, these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, I don't know if you caught this or not, but two of the guys in that list have labels attached to their names. Matthew the tax collector and Simon the Zealot. Now, we tend to read right over those descriptions without realizing the significance of what's being said there. So let me start with Simon the Zealot. A zealot was somebody who believed that the people of Israel needed to do anything they could to throw off the shackles of Rome and live as their own sovereign nation. The zealots were always stirring up trouble. They were being arrested by the Romans. So when it says Simon the Zealot, that was actually putting a political label next to his name. It would be like saying, Chuck the Tea Party guy, which would imply that the Tea Party must be really important to Chuck because we identify him with it. So there was Simon the Zealot. Then in the same group, there was Matthew the tax collector. In other words, Matthew worked for Rome. He collected taxes for Rome. So he not only believed in big government, he was helping raise the money for it off the backs of his own people. Matthew the tax collector would be kind of like saying in our culture, Rick the Democrat. So you've basically got Chuck the Tea Party guy and Rick the Democrat, and the two of them were thrown together in this little band of disciples who were following Jesus. I'm sure it made for some awesome conversation around the campfire at night, because those two guys were as opposite as you could get. But listen, eventually their political differences were overshadowed by a more important and more compelling reality, because they came to understand that they were ultimately citizens of an eternal kingdom that was bigger than any of the little kingdoms of this world. And the one thing that united them was far more important than anything that might divide them. And Jesus said, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And those words rang in the minds of those men, and they never forgot them, and they changed the world. I mean, think about it. Here was this little band of believers, common men. No political clout, no satellite TV, no radio, no printing press, no technology at all, no social media. All they had was word of mouth. But they loved one another so deeply and so authentically that within weeks there were thousands of new believers, and within 300 years they transformed the Roman Empire. So if we're going to be like them, we need to live in this tension. We can disagree politically, but we need to love unconditionally. Now, here's what I know. I know that we all know how to do the first part, right? Not a big deal. We're always disagreeing politically. I want to challenge you today on that second part. Here's my challenge, and I want to push you a little bit. So here's the assignment. Look for an opportunity to love unconditionally someone with whom you disagree politically. Now, you might say, well, Mark, I don't even know anybody I disagree with politically. Okay, that's a problem right there. It really is. And if you ever find yourself saying, I can't understand how anybody could believe that, I don't know how anybody could ever vote that way. If you find yourself saying that, here's what you're confessing. Here's what that means. It means that you've never taken the time to try to understand people who don't think like you. So look for an opportunity to love unconditionally someone with whom you disagree politically in these next few months. Now, for the sake of clarity, because what I'm talking about today is always a minefield, right? So I'll probably still get emails, but for the sake of clarity, let me try to wrap this all up by answering 4 questions. Here's the first question. Question number 1, should I have political opinions? The answer is yes, absolutely. Because we have the privilege of living in a country where we get to have a voice in the political process. So it is important for us to think about those issues and to think seriously about them. But let me say this, Our political opinions should always be informed by our faith and not the other way around. We should never try to shoehorn our faith into our predetermined political opinions, because Jesus did not come to be a footnote to a political platform. He did not come to support an existing political structure. In the words of Pastor Tony Evans, Jesus did not come to take sides. Jesus came to take over. So should I have political opinions? Yes, you should, and you should think deeply about them and make sure that they're informed by Scripture. Number 2, should I share my political opinions? And my answer to that is maybe. Because we need to be able to engage in healthy political discourse. It's really important for us as a culture to be able to do that. But here's the thing. We need to figure out how to do that at the right time, in the right way, with the right people. And do you know what that usually requires? It requires building a relationship with someone first and trying to hear their story and understand where they're coming from before we try to get them to listen to us. And then we should share political opinions the same way we would share any other opinion, with grace, gentleness, and humility. So if you're a Christian, and this may hurt a little bit, if you're a Christian, do you realize that in the New Testament we're told not to gossip? Do you know that applies to political conversations as well? Did you know, if you're a Christian, we're told to not let any unwholesome word come out of our mouths, but only that which will build other people up? Did you know that during a political season, God doesn't kind of reach down and say, hey, you know what? We're going to take those verses out of the Bible for now, and then after the election, we'll put them back in. So should I share my political opinions? I would say maybe, if you're mature enough to do that in the right way, in the right time, in the right spirit. Then number 3, should I make a political point at the expense of spiritual influence? And my answer to that is no. No. See, if you're a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, do you know what he said about us? He said, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. In other words, we have been called to bring the light and the flavor of God's kingdom into the smaller kingdoms of this world. We are called to use our influence to point people to the only real source of hope there is and the only real source of grace and truth. We should never give up that influence unnecessarily. Don't ever trade spiritual influence for the chance to make a political point. Now, let me tell you one way that I try to apply this. And please, I'm not saying you need to do this. I'm just telling you what I choose to do. So years ago, I stopped putting up political signs in my front yard, okay? It's not that I don't have political opinions. I do have political opinions. In fact, my wife would tell you that I have opinions about pretty much everything. But here's the thing. We want to do our best to love our neighbors and to serve our neighbors and to build a relationship with them. And I don't know where my neighbors stand politically, but I do know this. I don't want to make a political point and in the process lose my ability to have a spiritual conversation, especially in a politically divided culture. I don't want to do anything that would cost me influence. And besides that, my neighbors all know what I do for a living. And I don't ever want them to think that the church I lead is only open to those who agree with a particular political platform. Let me just remind you of something. All these problems that we hear about on the news every day, whether it's border security or health care or tax reform, whatever it might be, 100 years from now, nobody will even care about those things. And listen, we could have the world's best health care in our country, but that won't ever change a human heart. We can have the best immigration policies there are, but that won't save a single marriage. We can have the perfect tax code, but that won't rescue a single person from addiction. No other organization on the planet has the privilege to declare a message of hope that will change the lives of people. It is God, not government, that can change a human heart. And that's why we should never give up spiritual influence just to make a political point. One last question. You can probably guess the answer to this one. Should I jeopardize a relationship over a political position? And the answer is absolutely not. And I think this is one of the most tragic things that I see happening right now. We should never walk away from a relationship over a political issue. And here's why. Because after the next election is over and things settle down, then suddenly that guy at work or that lady at work or your neighbor or an extended family member, they have a need. They have a question. But they don't feel like they can invite you into that because you've lost that relationship over something that seemed like a really, really big deal at the moment, but a year later or a few years later, you can't even really remember what the issue was. So let me just kind of sum all this up this way. And if you don't hear anything else, please just hear this final statement. And it's simply this. Your political candidate, whoever that may be, your political candidate will win or lose based on how American citizens vote on a Tuesday in November. But the church will win or lose based on our behavior every single day between now and then. You say that again. Your political candidate will win or lose based on how the citizens of the United States vote on a Tuesday in November, and I hope everybody listening to this message will vote. But the church will win or lose based on how we treat each other and love our world every single day between now and then. So let's disagree politically. That's healthy. But let's always, 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 always love unconditionally.